All right, we don't need to record this.
Right here in the United States. Many people, including right here in the United States, into food insecurity. Every nation discovered how fragile our agricultural and food systems are. In many countries, their collapse brought millions to the brink of starvation. As global trade is restored, each nation faces supply chain problems, including the shipment of food commodities due to labor, fuel, transportation, and equipment shortages. This affected ports, shipping, transportation, and storage hubs worldwide. Climate change is driving extreme drought and floods, causing large-scale natural and humanitarian disasters from the Horn of Africa to Pakistan. And the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the takeover by the Taliban, and global sanctions have resulted in a large-scale food security crisis for the Afghan people. And then came the invasion of Ukraine that reduced or cut off altogether exports of corn, wheat, barley, sunflower seed, and fertilizer from Ukraine and Western Russia. Fuel and energy are also affected by the war, and this has a huge impact on the transport, storage, and distribution of food, including the cost of food. Turkey and African and Middle Eastern nations were most affected, as they are major importers of Ukrainian and Russian commodities. Also affected are international humanitarian organizations like the World Food Program, which purchases Ukrainian and Russian commodities to feed millions of global victims of natural disasters, war, and conflict. This wasn't a perfect storm, it was a monstrous storm. Thankfully, the United Nations and Turkey brokered an agreement for Ukrainian exports so that commodities could reach Africa and the Middle East. Even so, Ukrainian exports are about half of what they were. And how much Ukrainian farmers will be able to plant and harvest in the year to come is still uncertain. Last Thursday, the U.S. Department of Agriculture projected that the world food supply should be sufficient in 2023, quote, with a little bit of luck, end quote, in the weather. I emphasize that fingers crossed view about the weather. The USDA also added that nations must ensure markets remain open and free-flowing, and it asked countries not to impose export bans. In May, the U.S. Congress appropriated $4.35 billion in additional food assistance in the Ukraine supplemental. And I'm guessing that there'll be increases in the final omnibus appropriations bill at the end of the year. But the underlying fragilities and the increasing number of people at risk are still with us. And many regions of the world will continue to be vulnerable to increasing food insecurity. And so I look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say on these matters and how we can best address them in the coming months. And with that, I will yield back my time.
Thank you, Congressman. Caitlin?
Thank you so much. Thank you to American Leadership Initiative for convening today's discussion, and to Representative McGovern for your comprehensive opening remarks. I'll give an overview of what I understand as how I define the global food crisis right now, and how I see this affecting U.S. national security. So real briefly, I'll look on food prices, fertilizer prices, humanitarian assistance, and also global inflation and the strength of the U.S. dollar. Food prices right now, we've seen the food prices declining over the past 6 months, but they're still 5.5% higher than they were this time last year overall. Some groups of food, and this is global prices, are still much, much higher. Meat is almost 8% higher than in price than it was this time last year. Cereal prices over 11% higher, and dairy prices over 20% higher than they were this time last year. So food prices remain elevated. In the United States too, price of food at grocery stores is 13% higher than it was this time last year, and price of food in restaurants is 8.5% higher. So food prices globally and the United States much higher than they were a year ago. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an important factor in these increases, and what happens is that as families' incomes are fixed, generally speaking, they shift from being able to purchase more food and more nutritious food to using the same amount of money to purchase food that's of lower nutritional value. So that's the way that we see this translating into at the household level globally and in the United States. Fertilizer prices as well. World Bank says that fertilizer prices have tripled over the past 2 years. What this means is that planting plans have shifted worldwide in the United States, in many other agricultural powerhouses, and low and middle income countries. Particularly low and middle income countries, this threatens to further reduce agricultural yields. These farmers already used for low amounts of fertilizer, they'll be able to use even less, having lower harvests in years to come. As the representative noted, cost of humanitarian assistance is higher, so the cost of food itself is higher, and the cost of running these operations is higher. And finally, given global inflation and efforts to combat it, given the strength of the US dollar right now, countries' debt is worth much more. So they have less fiscal space to work with, and they have to pay more to import food, more to import fertilizers. So low and middle income countries are getting hit from a lot of places right now. So to get to the specific topic of today's panel about impacts on US national security, US national security strategy was released last week with significant language around food security, which in and of itself, I would say, places food security centrally in this umbrella of national security concerns. What I don't think that this strategy did, and I don't think is necessarily its place to do this, but it didn't tell us how global food insecurity is affecting US national security. And I think that this is something that we in the food security community can take for granted, is that when we speak about this connection, others will automatically understand what it means. And I think that it would behoove us to make that connection for our audience. And so I'll lay out just a few ways that I see global food insecurity affecting US national security. I see when food insecurity can erode security and governance and lead a region or a country to be a breeding ground for terrorism, with terrorists that can attack US allies or the United States directly. When food insecurity contributes to unplanned mass migration, threatening a US ally or the United States directly. When food insecurity contributes to political instability or political fragility that affects countries of strategic importance to the United States. And also when food insecurity can be a tool for political influence among bad actors. And this can be in a country where a political party is running and buying influence through food. Or it could be, as we're seeing on a global scale right now with Russia, very openly using its agricultural exports as a way to quell dissent among importers. And it states this directly with former President Medvedev saying that food is Russia's silent and menacing tool. So we see this through a number of ways, but I just want to make those explicit. So I think it's important to do that. And one final note, and this is something that I think that Representative McGovern will agree with because we've spoken about this same topic, but another direct way that this can affect US national security is when food prices increase, as we're seeing in the US, as I laid out earlier. It hurts already food insecure people the worst and the first, including vulnerable populations like US military families, who, as we know from data released this summer, are already far more insecure than average population, which affects military recruitment, readiness, and retention. So with that, I am happy to conclude and look forward to hearing from my other esteemed panelists.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was a great overview. Eric, you want to talk to us from the hunger and food insecurity perspective?
Yes, I can. And first of all, let me want to thank American Leadership Initiative for inviting me here today. It's great to be a part of such a distinguished panel of dedicated hunger champions. And I really do look forward to our discussion today on this very important topic. As mentioned, my name is Eric Mitchell. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance to End Hunger. The Alliance is a coalition, an advocacy coalition of over 100 nonprofits, corporations, universities, foundations, who are all committed to ending hunger in the US and around the world. We believe in creating the political will to end hunger, not only here in the US, but also around the world. Now, as we talk about the war in Ukraine, it's hard to believe there's really been almost 8 months since the war in Ukraine started. And the fallout from the conflict has hit food insecure populations around the globe the hardest. As mentioned before. Together, Russia and Ukraine produce roughly 30% of the world's wheat exports. Ukraine is seen as the breadbasket of Europe, growing enough food every year to feed 400 million people. The World Food Program sources 40% of the wheat for its emergency food relief. Those programs come from Ukraine. Agriculture imports were hit hard Russia and Belarus are two of the world's largest producers of fertilizer. This means that beyond the immediate food implications of the war, the sudden spike in fertilizer prices have left agricultural development groups scrambling and has left smallholder farmers anxious about their livelihoods. This all came as many populations around the world were already struggling with food and nutrition insecurity due to climate change, conflict, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this war in Ukraine is causing even deeper problems for some of the world's most vulnerable people. The additional strain of food, fuel, and fertilizer export disruptions have caused by the war and ensuing record high food prices have put over 49 million people at risk of falling into famine. And that's according to the World Food Program. Countries hit hardest by the conflict include places such as the Horn of Africa that import large majorities of their grain from Ukraine. Nations reliant on food emergency aid are also seeing their crisis mount. Countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, and South Sudan, this crisis has only exacerbated the humanitarian crisis that we were seeing in those countries before the war. So the question is, what can we do? What can be done from here? Unfortunately, Ukraine war is just the latest event underscoring cracks and failures in our food systems. From inputs to production, to transportation, to markets, to dinner tables around the world, there are improvements that must be made in order to build a more resilient and sustainable food systems. Now, there are key actions that we can take on the policy and legislative front. We could talk about this a little later that have real impact on hunger and malnutrition. And I'll just give you an example of a few of those. Feed the Future, which is done through the Global Food Security Act, has made progress in key places around the globe when it comes to smallholder resilience, poverty, and nutrition. Since 2010, Feed the Future has lifted 23 million people out of poverty, and over 5 million more families no longer suffer from hunger. The Global Food Security Act, which reauthorizes this program, is working its way through Congress right now as we speak, having already passed the House of Representatives and is under consideration in the Senate. This bill has a real shot of passage this year. Congress also recently passed the Global Malnutrition Prevention and Treatment Act, which will further help coordinate U.S. action against global malnutrition. And next year, the Farm Bill is up for reauthorization. And these improvements are critical to both emergency and developmental program. I actually see the Farm Bill as an opportunity to actually put on record what the U.S. government is going to do to truly end hunger, not only here in the United States and around the world, and that this will be an opportunity to really make that happen. Overall, the United States needs to maintain its leadership role in combating hunger and malnutrition. We are very pleased to see commitments made by the Biden administration in emergency funding for global food security and nutrition, including most recently the announced at the UN General Assembly, $2.9 billion towards strengthening global food security. This sends a strong message around the world. A strong commitment must be needed, and it's up to all of us to continue to lean on our legislators and others, policymakers, to continue to work towards building a more resilient food system and to end hunger and malnutrition everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Dan Glickman? You're on mute. You're on mute.
The most frequent words of the Zoom era.
Exactly.
Okay. First of all, it's hard to carry forward with this great conversation of all the people who are on this panel, especially my friend Jim McGovern, who is the unequaled leader in food security, not only at home, but around the world, and helped to facilitate the White House Conference on Nutrition that was held about 3 weeks ago. It would have happened without Jim's leadership. So just to add on what everybody said, the whole crisis has shown how inextricably the world is linked together. So I was Secretary of Agriculture many, many years ago. And, I know a little bit about agriculture in the world, but as a result of this situation in Ukraine, it really never hit me beforehand what a powerful impact this country of Ukraine and Russia had on world grain and oilseed supplies. And so it's often called the breadbasket of the world. I used to think that Kansas was the breadbasket of the world, and I still do. But the fact of the matter is that the production, as was discussed before on grains and oilseeds impacted the world as a whole, including prices in the United States, but especially the vulnerable countries of the world that Eric and others have mentioned about. So how this links us together, we are not separate, and how it's impacted inflation rates around the world, and how it's created issues of political instability around the world because the most vulnerable are impacted by this. So we know what the problems are. And of course, they wouldn't all be ended overnight if the Russians would just get out of Ukraine, but it would help a lot because it not only has impacted the grains and food side of the picture, but it's had a dramatic effect on the energy side of the picture too. So energy and agriculture have been dislocated around the world because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whether it's gas in Europe or whether it's oil supplies throughout the developed world. Now, as Eric mentioned, one of the things we can do in the short term is ensure that the UN and other places have the appropriate humanitarian supplies to help people who are hungry and help people who are facing these high prices. So the World Food Program of the UN is the primary agency that feeds hungry people around the world. And so the US is the largest contributor to the World Food Program. We must continue to insist that we maintain our appropriations to WFP to make sure that the needy and hungry, not only in Central Europe, but worldwide, get that assistance. So that's the number one thing we can do. Number two is to continue our efforts to develop sustainable production in vulnerable areas in the world, particularly in East Africa, in South Asia, and other places which could increase their production if they had the appropriate tools and technical help, in which the U.S. should be, a major factor of. So, right now, short term, all we can do is try to end this just damn war. And the other thing we can do, I'm sorry, my phone don't know how to turn it off. And try to end this damn war. And the other thing, we can certainly do is to make sure that Congress continues its help under Jim McGovern's leadership for appropriations to deal with emergency relief.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Michelle Grogg with Cargill. And I think, she's going to talk to us a little bit about what the private sector is grappling with in the midst of this crisis and how they can help.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you, Dan. I agree with many of your comments, and Congressman, it's really a pleasure to be here with you and with a lot of our partners. And that's really going to be a theme of what I want to talk about. It is going to take partnership to address a lot of this. So as you've heard, the global food system is facing a lot of complex challenges, from the crisis in Ukraine to climate change. Supply chain and trade disruptions are ongoing, rising inflation, input costs impacting farmers. All of these are certainly rising threats to global food security. As Eric mentioned, we're seeing more countries, I think it's 38, are at risk of famine. So at Cargill, we're working every day to get food where it's needed, safely and responsibly. Our purpose as a company is to nourish the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way. And so we put food security at the center of our company's priorities. We are a key connector in the food system, so connecting farms to tables. We have a unique ability and a responsibility to work alongside farmers and communities to produce and move food around the world efficiently and effectively. Over the past 6 months, we've focused a lot of our effort on reopening food corridors, reconnecting supply chains that have been impacted by the crisis in Ukraine, as well as the ongoing implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the past year, we've leveraged our expertise and market access to provide 1.4 million farmer trainings on sustainable agricultural practices to help farmers protect their crops and increase productivity. This helps to support a steady flow of food and builds a more sustainable food supply, something that we have to work on. So how do we address the immediate, as well as making sure that we're investing in the longer term sustainable solutions? We have a long history of responding to urgent hunger and serving communities in need. And at the same time, we're striving to build a more resilient global food system for the long term. So leveraging the expertise that we have from being in business for over 157 years. But no single company, government, or initiative can do this alone. And so this notion of partnerships is really, really critical as we address the immediate needs, as well as the long-term resilience and rebuilding efforts that we'll need to focus on. At Cargill, we've stepped up our global commitments and partnerships. So we contributed $163 million during our fiscal year 22. We've allocated $55 million to support our Ukrainian colleagues and humanitarian efforts in the region. through our long-term NGO partners like the World Food Program, which Dan mentioned, World Central Kitchen, Red Cross, CARE, and a lot of local organizations that are working in Ukraine and in neighboring countries. As part of our commitment to Ukraine, Cargill made one of the largest corporate donations to the World Food Program, providing a $10 million grant to address both short-term immediate needs as well as to address the collateral implications of the war on other countries and continue to focus on that longer-term development, so helping farmers in Africa and boost productivity and incomes. We recently learned that of the $10 million grant that we gave, we did $2.5 million for the immediate work in Ukraine, and understand that that helped to feed 35,000 people for a month. So we know that we're making an impact. This notion of providing immediate support as well as addressing the long-term is really, really key. We have hungry people today we need to address. We know there's food security challenges in other regions as well. So providing meals to families impacted by natural disasters here in the United States and around the world, places like Asia and Central America. We're big supporters of school feeding programs here in the US as well as around the world. And are providing 19 million meals to those in need and helping to address the protein gap over the next 3 years through a recent $4.9 million donation to Feeding America. So I'll close by saying it's vital that we work together. We have to work across businesses, governments, and civil society to help strengthen communities and improve access to safe, nutritious food. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you all. What a great overview of the situation. And I'll just pause and add that American Leadership Initiative has been really talking about and supporting increased private public partnership. We think that's really important. So I guess I know that the US government recently committed $500 million to increase our production of fertilizer. Should we be doing more to step up our grain and fertilizer production so that we can be exporting more? I mean, in addition to, giving aid and food, which we certainly should we also be stepping up production to help fill the gap? I'll just throw that open to anyone that wants to jump in.
Thanks. I'm happy to jump in and then look forward to
Sure.
hearing from other panelists as well. I think that we two things when it means for producing fertilizer are very different from the ways we produce agriculture, obviously. When it comes to agriculture, early on in this war, there were calls to increase our own production of certain grains to make up for the global shortfall. We need to be mindful of our climate change goals, though, because the way that members of Congress proposed doing this was by taking certain land out of conservation programs to make use of it, which can be counterproductive when it comes to climate goals. And also it's not a quick fix. It's not like you can quickly convert land that's being conserved for agricultural use. So that's not a quick thing right there. When it comes to increasing fertilizer production, lots of fertilizer types. There are 3 main fertilizer types. Prices of all of them are increasing worldwide. I think that it's in our interest to increase production of fertilizers that we're able to do, but also knowing that not every country has equal stores of certain fertilizer resources. So fertilizer, that's certainly a very vexing problem. When it comes to agriculture, though, I think we need to be very mindful of our climate goals.
I would just add to what Caitlin very correctly said. Number one is that there's probably some limited increase in production without tearing up highly erodible lands. But we really have to be careful before we radically increase production, because we probably would have great ecological harm if we would overdo it. That's why we put land into reserve and this kind of thing. But there's some flexibility, and the U.S. is still exporting billions of dollars worth of agriculture products and grains overseas, and also providing relief on the humanitarian side of the picture. I would also mention on fertilizer. Fertilizer is largely costed by energy. That is, it's a natural gas and fossil fuel component, and therefore fertilizer costs have gone rapidly way up because basically the Russians have cut off the Ukrainians and so many other places in the world from free flow of natural gas and energy, and that's why you have to look at these issues both from an agriculture as well as an energy perspective.
And if I could just, I mean,
Please.
I agree with what has been said. Obviously, if Vladimir Putin would stop his war, that would help enormously. But the other thing is, while we're figuring out the kind of short-term immediate things that we can do, I think we also need to be focused right now on what are the long-term things that we can do. How do we work with countries to strengthen local and regional agricultural resiliency and infrastructure? And I would add to that, we just had this White House conference, we talked a lot about nutrition as well. I'd add to that, this needs to include strengthening nutritional content and availability of nutritional food for local communities and for large urban areas. But when we need to start talking about this in a more holistic approach that includes water management, clean water, addressing child nutrition and malnutrition, strengthening small farmers, environmental concerns. But we have to emphasize on helping get some of these countries to be more self-reliant and capable of their own food production and distribution and accessibility and affordability. And by the way, that's a priority for the United States too. We talked about that at this conference at the White House. So I just add that to the mix as well.
You would just add to what Jim said. He added all the components very nicely. Food waste is another component. We waste about a third of our food in the United States, but globally as well. For a lot of reasons, we throw it out, or it sell-by dates, or disincentive for people to eat food in developed countries. But whatever. But one thing this whole crisis has brought to the forefront, for really the first time globally, is how important food security is to global stability. And, oftentimes agriculture takes a second place role. And when the secretaries of state meet in these geopolitical G20, G8 summits, and historically, food and agriculture have not been hot topics at those summits. And now we're realizing the rest of the world how important these issues are, how they need to be in a prime location as well.
Yeah. So, Michelle, did you have something to say?
No, I was just going to add, I couldn't agree more with Dan. I think agriculture is how we're going to solve a lot of these problems. And I think the point that people are making are that these issues are really, really interconnected. So we really cannot take them individually. And so thinking about the trade-offs and the implications of the choices that we're making is really, really important. And agriculture is going to be a key solution to that.
So speaking of social unrest, we've seen obviously fairly dramatic social unrest in Sri Lanka, which has a number of, for a number of reasons, but obviously the rising cost of food was one. And I think, we're starting to see unrest in other countries as well. I wonder if one of you could talk about that and kind of what are we doing in addition to the food? Are we doing other, engaging in other ways to help solve or forestall more unrest?
Well, I just start by saying, it's like it is the best of times and the worst of times, like from Oliver Twist, but the worst of times is we got all these conflicts in the world. And just yesterday, how the Chinese leadership talked about that, don't mess around with Taiwan, because if you do, we'll go in. And right now we have heightening political and economic tensions with the second most economically powerful country in the world, and that's China. Plus, then we have this Russia, Ukraine situation, and now we have the Iranians supplying weapons to the Russians, drones and other kinds of things. We have the Saudis not being cooperative in turn the oil crisis. So all of these geopolitical things are happening at the same time. It really does make it complicated. And I would have to say that I think that the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken have done a tremendous job in trying to manage these problems, particularly the Ukraine crisis. And, we have managed to keep our allies together and, pushing the Russians back. And realize that doesn't stop the food crisis right now, but the only way we're going to get that under control is to try to get some stability in that region of the world.
I wouldn't want to. I definitely agree with everything that Secretary Glickman has mentioned, but I definitely don't want to underemphasize the importance that food security plays in stability. Many of the conflicts, like you just mentioned, many of the conflicts that we've seen around the world has been a result of local food crises that are happening at the national level, and including the migration situations you see around the world, including here in the United States. And so by investing in long-term solutions, kind of similar to what Congressman McGovern mentioned, by investing in those long-term solutions, agricultural development, things of that nature, helps to improve local livelihoods, helps to improve sustainability back at home, so that people do not have to risk their lives by traveling to other countries across the borders, joining other groups that are violent against our interests and other things. So food security is definitely a tool for diplomacy, is definitely a tool for sovereignty, and it's definitely something that we need to ensure that we are investing in.
Yeah, happy to add to that. We've been tracking protests over high food prices in many places, not just Sri Lanka, not just Pakistan, but Peru, Greece, Spain, Albania, Iraq, Lebanon, Kenya, lots of places where we're seeing this. When it comes to the response, I've heard two methods of response articulated here, one being humanitarian assistance, which is incredibly important, particularly when the cost of the food aid, cost of humanitarian operations increases, and when you need to increase the value of cash assistance so that folks can afford food at higher prices. And also long-term assistance, particularly through the Global Food Security Act. Always important to do both of those things. A third way of helping countries, particularly like the ones that I mentioned, to access food right now is through financing to help them afford the increased prices of imports. And I've seen increased attention to that from the very beginning. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization put out what it was calling a food import finance facility, a proposal for this financing facility. There's continued conversation around that for that facility, but this continues to figure prominently in conversations around even at the World Bank IMF fall meetings that we had last week, conversations around ways to help these countries that might not be the targets of our humanitarian assistance or even programs like Feed the Future, but are nonetheless very, very important to help them afford the higher prices of food and fertilizer right now.
Okay, well, we thank you. We have a whole bunch of questions that have come in that I'm going to start to go through. One was one that I was actually going to ask, which is, you see more countries imposing policies to restrict exports of food or limit exports of food, both as a reaction to global inflation and, to really minimize their own food shortages. How can we kind of prevent, using trade to limit the open market for food? And, is there a global solution at this time?
And I'm happy to jump in on that. I mean,
Please.
Cargill certainly is a big advocate for trade. We really need governments and organizations to stand united in the commitment to keep food moving and keep agricultural markets open. We really want to guard against any unjustified restrictions on exports. Food shouldn't be used as a weapon. And so it's really important that we can grow food where it should be grown and trade it to places where it's needed. And so where we can collaborate on advocacy and things like that, would argue that that's really, really important right now.
This is a perennial problem. Whenever you have a conflict or a crisis in the world, or you have natural disasters, countries will kind of tend to go back into their shells a bit. And I know that, Michelle, you've seen this because Cargill is one of the largest enterprises in the world dealing with the movement of agriculture commodities. And you've seen that in India right now. The Indians have basically, I don't know what it is today, but they stopped many of their grain exports for self-protection. So, this is troubling, but countries always do that. And we just have to be in a leadership role. The private and public sectors pushing back on that because, they will need our products too. So they can't have it both ways, basically. And we just, this is a nice thing that I've seen both Secretary Vilsack and Secretary Blinken from the public sector and companies like Cargill from the private sector doing their best to make sure that borders are as open as humanly possible. But this is kind of a part of human nature. People will try to protect their own, even if it's not reasonable.
Thank you. It seems to me that it would also be a good topic for, the G7, the G20, and some of these leadership groups to really take on at a higher level. We have sorry, Caitlin, go ahead.
Sorry, not to. having worked very in depth within the G7 and G20 context, just want to say issues like this do rise to the level of leaders' discussions. And there are continual calls for countries to refrain from imposing export restrictions for the reasons that former Secretary Glickman outlined. There's some really good resources out there, including one put forward by IFPRI that tracks the restrictions that are in place right now. But yeah, it's a natural instinct to want to do that. At the end of the day, though, when countries do impose those restrictions, it hurts their producers, because their producers are not able to take advantage of high global prices. So their own producers suffer, unfortunately.
So there's a question here about water levels in the US being low. And, our question about, is the US seeing a drought, and will we have a short crop this year? So I wanted to pose that, and obviously water issues are a global issue at this point as well.
Well, I'm not an expert on all agriculture in the United States, but we're having a drought in Massachusetts. So we had a drought in Massachusetts, and our farmers had a difficult time. And last year they had too much rain, which goes back into which kind of should make us focus more on dealing with climate change and the impacts of climate change. I think it's important that the Congress passed and the president signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes the biggest investment to combat climate change ever in our history, and a big chunk of that is focused on helping our farmers. Water is an issue, but the changing climate has done a number. In Massachusetts, we have, our winters are shorter. They're not as severe. There are diseases that are appearing that didn't exist before up here, and invasive species that are living through the winter. It's all interconnected, but we have not been paying attention to this issue of the climate crisis. We're coming to it, I would say, very late in the game. Still, hopefully not too late, but obviously, this is a huge issue.
Just to augment what Jim just said, so vast areas of the American West and parts of the Northeast are really suffering from drought, but you have other regions of the country that are suffering from excessive water. Then you look at the world, Bangladesh, Pakistan, these are big grain producing areas suffering from the highest rainfall in decades, if not centuries. And then you take it to the fact that 71% of the world's water is used for agriculture to raise crops and feed animals. Only about 29% is for everything else, which is drinking, industrial use, you name it. And so you really see how, if the climate crisis is not dealt with very well, we will have continued periods of high and excessive rainfall in certain parts of the world, and droughts and baked soil in other parts of the world. And so how we manage that will have a lot to do with not only how the rest of the world is producing in the future, but how we in the United States can continue to be very lush producers of food products in the future.
Thank you. So we have a question here from David Beckman, who I believe used to be head of Bread for the World. And he's asking, the World Bank says that global poverty has dropped from 10% in 2020 to 9% in 2022. But the FAO says says that global food insecurity has increased from 9.2 to 9.8%. So it seems like the food crisis now is focused mainly on countries like Afghanistan and Somalia, where war and climate change are increasing the number of displaced people and, causing really extreme hunger. Is this the right focus right now?
I'm happy to jump in here. It's a great question, and honor to have David Beckman joining us here for this conversation. I think it gets kind of fuzzy comparing numbers like this. I'm not sure that the time frame is exactly the same. Not sure exactly if the FAO was including all forms of hunger in its measurement here, acute food insecurity as well as marginal food insecurity. I'm not quite sure. But I want to say that all forms of food insecurity are likely to increase this year, in large part as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. I do think that we're seeing, well, I know that we are predicted to see a very sharp increase in the number of people experiencing acute food insecurity, which begs for increased funding for these efforts and also different ways of doing business, including through localization, which we hear USAID emphasizing a lot. But I want to say that I don't think that our focus should shift entirely to that by any stretch. I think that the increasing effects of climate change mean that we should continue to focus on agriculture in developing countries. But something we haven't mentioned so far in this conversation is focus on making healthy diets affordable for people all over the world. One very important statistic that I think doesn't get mentioned as much as it could in conversations like this is that at the same time that the UNFAO says that as much as 828 million people are food insecure, they also noted that up to 40% of the world's population can't afford the cheapest form of a healthy diet. So it means that most people are, they might be getting enough calories, they might be filling their bellies with staple foods, but they're not accessing the nutritious foods that we know are necessary for healthy lifestyles. And as we saw here in the United States during the COVID pandemic, when those who were suffering from diet-related diseases were the ones who were most affected by the pandemic. So I think that the focus should also be, and increasingly so, on making healthy diets affordable for people around the world.
You know, the other thing I would say is that there are some actually good things happening in the world. The McGovern-Dole program, you know, is feeding tens of thousands of people, particularly young girls, who would otherwise perhaps be in a tragic domestic relations situation. And one of the things I've suggested to USAID and others is that we, and by the way, companies like Cargill are doing amazing things globally with on the ground efforts to change people's lives on the ground. And some of that is with their own revenue, some of that's with US government funding or partnership funding. And so sharing those practices, I think, would be helpful in letting the American people know what the impact of all of that is, because American people basically historically have been very charitable and not just for aid, but also to help people bootstrap themselves up as well, so they can produce agricultural products at home for themselves, which Jim McGovern talked about before.
Yeah, and I just want to, since Dan Glickman brought up the McGovern-Dole program, and somebody, I think you mentioned me in the introduction.
Yes.
I'm very proud of that. But there would be no McGovern-Dole program without Dan Glickman. When he was Secretary of Agriculture, George McGovern and I went and met with President Clinton, and Dan was Secretary of Agriculture at the time, to propose this idea of a global, school feeding program. And and other members of the cabinet were there, and I think we're like, this is a pie in the sky, nice idea about, what the hell are we going to do about it? And Dan actually came up with the money to get the pilot going, which we ultimately translated into education. But I just want the record to reflect his crucial role in finding money within USDA's budget to get this pilot up and running. And that pilot helped us perfect, the legislation. And it was really, it really was, anyway, I just wanted to make sure everybody knows how wonderful he is.
Well,
But
I thank you, but I would have to say Jim McGovern had a lot to do with it. And the other thing I would tell you is the names on that, Dole, McGovern. It's important to recognize food security issues have historically been some of the most bipartisan issues of our country. It's brought people together from conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats and everybody in between, because feeding hungry people, I think, has historically not been part of the partisan fray. Now, it's a little more that way today, but notwithstanding that, and I was disappointed. I think there were quite a few, I don't mean this to be partisan, but the Global Food Security Act had quite a few Republican no's when that bill is voted upon. That's too bad. But historically, the bipartisan nature of everything we're talking about today it's been part and parcel of American history for the last 50, 60, 70 years.
Well, thank you both really for your leadership on this really important issue. And actually, I was going to ask, so I know the House passed the Global Food Security Reauthorization Act, and the Senate has now referred it to the Foreign Relations Committee. What are the prospects of it passing?
I could jump in. I mean, I think there's a lot of momentum. I'll say that. There's huge bipartisan support. Going back again to Secretary Glickman's point, on the Senate side, you have Senator Reese supporting it, Senator Grassley, a number of Republican senators. We're trying to get more, and we're actually pushing for more. So for those of y'all who have relationships in some of these key offices, please, urge them to co-sponsor this bill. There's huge support to try to get something done. I'm assuming, I guess, post midterms, but there are commitments on both sides of the aisle, both from Senator Reese, Senator Casey, all the leaders who are championing this legislation to see something done soon with the bill. So I'm feeling positive, which is something to say, as a result to people say the Senate is where legislation goes to die, but I do feel positive about the GFSA actually seeing the end of the day, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, Eric, if you feel good, I feel good. But let me just say that, and I'm hoping that the prospects are good. And look, Congress has done a lot already to deal with some of these issues, but a lot more needs to be done because the problem is so huge, both in terms of funding and expanding the reach of our existing programs. When President Biden announced in September at the UN General Assembly that the U.S. is committing an additional $2.9 billion to strengthen global food security, those are funds that Congress already appropriated, but the administration had yet to obligate and to spend. So, and that included $200 million that USAID pledged to address global child malnutrition, money that Congress appropriated. And I know this because I'm the principal co-lead on the annual bipartisan letter to appropriations seeking even more funding for these child nutrition programs. But look, more needs to be done. And we talked earlier about how this is a security issue. It's a national security issue. It's an international security issue. Look, you can live without a lot of things. You can't live without food. And, I think one of the challenges, and this is one of the reasons why we had a White House conference on this topic to deal with domestic hunger. But I think the same applies globally. And that is, look, this issue intersects with 1,000 other issues, right? And we need to be better coordinated, not only to deal with the short term, but the long term. Hunger is a political condition at the end of the day. And the issue is whether we have the political will to pull all the pieces together. So yeah, it's about getting food to people, but it's about climate change. It's about housing. It's about sustainability. It's about, a job that pays a wage you can actually afford to buy food. It's about making nutritional food more accessible and available. So it's a whole bunch of stuff. And sometimes I feel when we talk about global hunger, we respond to emergency. We do have some long-term planning, but I think we need to do a better job of kind of coordinating, a more holistic approach, to dealing with it. This is a huge issue. More people are dying of hunger than of war. I mean, and the diet-related diseases that are associated with the bad diets that people are getting, the number is astronomical. So, in any event, I think we need to do more. Others need to do more as well. And just one final thing, and it's tough politically right now. We're dealing with inflation here in the United States. So you go to members of Congress and say, well, we need you to do more to help with the international effort, and they're going to be afraid the constituents are going to say, well, you're not doing enough to deal with the rising cost of food here in the United States. And so I think this is a time when people need to go and talk to their elected officials and help educate them about what the reality is, and also to help explain why more investment in the long run is not just good for people halfway around the world, but good for people halfway down the block.
Yeah, well, thank you all. And I'm really kind of delighted to hear that it is a bipartisan issue, which, in this day of where so few things are bipartisan, it's really hopeful. So we're gonna, if you all have time, we have a few more questions and then we will wrap up. So we have Rick Leach, who is the former head of WFP USA, also joining us. So we have a great audience in addition to a great panel. And he says, is USDA providing support tapping into its domestic expertise to help build safety nets and increase resiliency in food insecure countries consistent with the authority provided in the last Farm Bill.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that. If not, we will kind of
I
get back
think
to
that,
him.
I think Secretary Vilsack has indicated that the answer to that is yes, but USAID is historically taken the lead with respect to development issues globally, but oftentimes it's the USDA people on the ground that really do have a lot of the expertise. So I hope the answer to his question, Rick's question, is yes. And Rick is a great humanitarian leader on his own. For those who know him, know that he saved many lives during his years in helping hungry people.
And I concur with that. He's a wonderful, wonderful human being. So
Agreed.
We'll all agree.
That's great. We have a couple questions related to the quality of US aid and the fact that sometimes, our aid doesn't work as it should, doesn't really get to, the hungry and poor people that need it. Sometimes they're competing priorities, where we push farmers to invest in one thing, and then that turns out to have, sort of unforeseen consequences. What are we doing to kind of improve the quality of aid? And I'll just give a personal anecdote. When I was young, my father worked at USAID, and we lived in Nigeria for 4 years during the Biafran War. And the US government sent, there was massive famine. And at one point, the US government sent crates of basically Boost, those little high protein drinks in cans. Well, as you can imagine, that was just not what, the local population had no idea what to do with that. So there were just, thousands of these cans, just stacked up. I know things have gotten much better since then. But I do know that it's still an issue where a lot of times we give a lot of money and it, because of a whole host of reasons, whether it's corrupt regimes, bad supply chains, conflicting goals, things don't really get to the people who need it most.
well, let me just say, I think things have gotten better and are getting better. They're not perfect, right? And for all of these programs, I mean, they're a work in progress, right? I mean, when things work, then you continue to move in that direction. When they don't work, you need to make adjustments and change things. I've heard reports that some of the stuff we've sent to Ukraine is stuff that, quite frankly, we shouldn't be sending to Ukraine, that nobody wants it, whatever it was, in terms of some of the food that's gone there. I think that's being remedied. One of the great things about the McGovern-Dole program, the way it operates, is that we don't send money to governments. We work with NGOs that have a proven record of being able to deliver on the ground. And they work with local communities and schools to build up a program that makes sure that every dollar and that every bit of food that is sent gets to the children. And then they work on creating and making it sustainable so that we no longer have to continue to support that particular project. But look, it's no sense of sending aid to for a good cause if it's not going to get to do the good cause. And so we're constantly vigilant on that. And I think we're getting better. We're not perfect, but if people have specific ideas on how we can tighten things up, I'm all ears, because I don't want, nothing's worse than appropriating money for helping to feed hungry people and having it not feed hungry people.
On the other hand, I talked about sharing best practices. There are a lot of great things that are being done on the ground that, we may not be very good storytellers, and maybe the government isn't very good at letting people know how lives have actually been impacted. The private sector is better than that than the government. So I think the government could do a lot better job, and maybe the NGOs community as well, in telling the stories of where people's lives have actually been impacted positively. You know, the whole Afghan experience is not necessarily our brightest hour in terms of the billions and billions of dollars that went into development assistance there. And look at Afghanistan right now. And I'm not saying that it was anybody's fault, because we were all in that from a long period of time. And I think that tended to afflict a lot of the perspectives about our assistance and aid package. But on the other hand, and Congress has done a pretty good job of doing oversight over this too, which is really an important role for them to do. It's one of their big roles, how we spend our money, because it's not always perfect. But on the other hand, there are good stories out there, and we need to do a better job of talking about them.
And I want to concur with Dan on that. You know, every chance I get when I speak to Feed the Future, I mean, I say the same thing. There are members of Congress who don't know the success stories, or who don't know all the good that some of this aid is doing. And certainly, you know, it's something that we need to do a better job of informing the general public. But there are some really incredible stories, and there are organizations like Feed the Future, McGovern Dole program. I go right down the list of, you know, Food for Peace, whatever, that are doing amazing things. You know, nobody's perfect. When there's imperfections, we need to fix them. But I think you're right. I mean, we need to do a better job of telling the story of all the good things that are being done.
I couldn't agree more. And I will say, Michelle, just similarly, I think I know the private sector is doing a great deal, and often doesn't tell a good story. You know, we don't really hear. We tend to not hear the success stories. You know, bad news is always more interesting than good news. Well, thank you all. I think this has been a really, really interesting panel discussing an incredibly important issue, and one that, you know, sadly is going to be around for a long time. And we really need to look at both short-term solutions, which I think you all have discussed, but really as well long-term solutions, you know, to address the challenges of climate and other kind of supply chain challenges, to ensure that you know, that we can keep the world fed and properly and healthy going forward. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
Bye-bye.